Okay, I'm going to jump to the last defense we're going to talk about. It's called the new value defense. So just taking a look, we on 547C, we talked about one, contemporaneous exchange defense, two, the ordinary course defense, and we're going to jump to four, which is known as the subsequent new value defense. As you can tell, I highlighted the word after in yellow, so we're going to be discussing why it's called the subsequent new value defense and going into the defense in general. Generally speaking, what the new value defense says is that if you receive a preferential transfer, let's say value of $100,000 during the preference period, and then after that you ship $100,000 worth of product or you provide $100,000 worth of services and you're not paid and it remains unpaid, then you can set off that value against the transfer that came before. So what happens if the product was paid for and the services were paid for later in the preference period? Can you still use that new value to set off against the previous transfer? Excuse me. Well, this district court was faced with that situation in a rather large case, and the district court looked at the statute. First, the court noted, and this is a quote from the opinion, that the subsequent new value defense will help a creditor escape preference liability to the extent that it provided new value after the debtor made a preference transfer to the creditor. So we already went over that. But what if it's unpaid? I loved reading this. On the other hand, the subsequent new value defense will not apply if the creditor who has the burden of proof does not establish that, quote, the debtor did not make an otherwise unavoidable transfer on account of the new value. I have to laugh because, what could that possibly mean? So the court tries to explain it. It's not the court's fault. The way the statute is written is just absurd. Well, the court did a good job of cutting through the double negatives. Basically said, you can't use, let's say you're using the value of your product or service and setting that off against a prior preferential transfer. You can't use the value of that and also get paid for the value. You can't use it twice. You can't get paid for it and use the value and set it off. You can only use it once. Well, the court did a good job of cutting through the double negatives. Basically said, you can't use, let's say you're using the value of your product or service and setting that off against a prior preferential transfer. You can't use the value of that and also get paid for the value. You can't use it twice. You can't get paid for it and use the value and set it off. You can only use it once. Well, let's take a closer look at this. So the court is saying, let's say you get a preferential transfer of $100,000, and then you ship product worth $100,000, and then later, so you set it off, and then theoretically you'd be able to set off the $100,000 product that you delivered against the prior transfer. But let's say later in the case, you get a payment for those goods that you delivered. You get a payment of $100,000, and let's say you're able to set off that $100,000 against other new value that you're not paid for. So is this an otherwise unavoidable transfer? In other words, can you use the new value defense again, or is the code saying an otherwise unavoidable transfer means otherwise, using another part of the bankruptcy code? In other words, ordinary course, contemporaneous exchange, another defense. Or is it saying you can't use any defense. And that's really what this court decided. The court decided you can use the new value defense. So in other words, that payment, the 100,000 that paid for the product which you used and set off, you used under the new value defense, that payment itself can also be defended under the subsequent new value defense, and does not have to be avoided because you're not using another defense outside of the new value defense. That's basically what it decided. So, not to beat a dead horse, but the bankruptcy court, the district court affirmed the bankruptcy court decision and granted the new value defense, even though it had been paid and even though it was avoidable, but not otherwise avoidable. Barnhill decided that for the purposes of deciding whether a preference was received in the preference period, that the honor date, that the clear date of the check is what is relevant. However, what's a little bit confusing is that for new value purposes, it's the date the check was received. And why is that? Because when you get a check in, then you're willing to supply more product or services, and it's the check receipt date that initiates the willingness to provide unsecured credit for product and services. So that's the date that the court considers when deciding whether there was a subsequent transfer of value or not. That concludes this CLE video on basic preference law. Hope you enjoyed it.